Okay, we're going to get this underway. Good morning, everyone. My name is Berit Ashla, and I am the Executive Director here at the David Brower Center, where you find yourself this morning. We are delighted to have you here, and we are delighted to be serving as the venue for this event for really two reasons. The incredible content of today's program, but also the exhibit downstairs is a perfect fit, we believe, for the work that you'll be talking about today. I'm curious to know how many of you have had a chance to see down in the Hazel Wolf Gallery, Petrochemical America. Okay, good, not the whole room. What I'd really love to do is encourage all of you to take some time. We do have a very full house today, and so, but on your lunch break or after today's symposium, if you have an opportunity to take a look at Petrochemical America, we really feel that the work speaks for itself. What this is an exhibit that's featuring the work of Richard Misrak and Kate Orff. We're delighted to have the incredible photographer Richard Misrak in the house today, so hopefully you'll have a chance to speak with him. Richard, I don't know if you... Yes, he's a shy and retiring photographer, but we're delighted to have Richard here in the house, just back from some extensive travels. So again, timing is everything, and so pleased to have Richard here. What I want to let you know, too, is that Richard will be speaking about Petrochemical America and his extensive body of work next Thursday, November 7th, from 7 to 8:30. Here at the Brower Center, and it promises to be an incredible evening where you can really go deeper into the work. What Petrochemical America is a chronicle of the Mississippi Delta region, specifically Cancer Alley, which is a 150-mile stretch from Baton Rouge to New Orleans. And it's called Cancer Alley because of the extraordinary spikes in cancer rates along that area due to the some 100 refineries along this landscape in the Mississippi Delta. On a personal note, when I was working in philanthropy some 15 years ago, I was meeting with activists along this corridor. And I remember vividly one of the activists saying to me, "You know, I knew I had rights, but I didn't really know what they were." And for this particular activist community, mapping their community, mapping the toxins in their community was kind of the avenue in to arming themselves politically to make some significant policy changes. That change is ongoing, and something like Petrochemical America is really a beautiful demonstration of the work that needs to be done, but the way that mapping and art and politics can collide in a way that can hopefully inspire people on the ground as well as policymakers. Because what Petrochemical America really is an ecological atlas. It's composed of drawings and maps that help complex historical, economic, and ecological factors that affect that region of the Mississippi Delta. So again, if you don't have a chance to visit, please come back on Thursday night. We'd love to have you. Another thing to know is that there's a beautiful companion book to this work with extensive maps and Richard's photos and Kate's musings about what this region could be, how we could reconceive this part of the Mississippi Delta region. So, really, I'm just here to welcome you. And the person who's really going to go over the rest of today is Anthony Cascardi, who is the Dean of the Arts and Humanities Division, the College of Letters and Science at UC Berkeley. So without further ado, welcome, enjoy your stay, and I hope you'll come back to the Brower Center for our many more programs that will be coming up in the months ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks to the Brower Center, which is just a marvelous space for us to be in. We've only been here less than an hour, and we already feel quite at home. So thank you. I want to say just a few brief words of welcome to all of you here, and special words of welcome to our visitors from UCLA for having made the trip up. UCLA is a co-collaborator, co-conspirator in the joint Mellon-funded project on global urban humanities. And it's been really a pleasure to work with them. I also want to say a special word of thanks to the steering committee at Berkeley here, and to my co-PI, Jennifer Waldstein, to the College of Environmental Design, for a tremendous amount of work that went into pulling this together with the extraordinary, capable, and energetic and enthusiastic help of Susan Moffett, who is our project director. Also to everyone who was involved in reviewing the submission for the MAP competition, which we'll have quite a bit more to say about in the middle of the day. But I just want to remark that what you see on the wall are the poster submissions that correspond to the much richer, deeper, live web submissions of each of the MAP entries. Please, during the breaks, have a look at the posters, but above all, take a look whether on your laptops or on the monitors outside at the interactive maps. They are incredibly rich and fascinating, and I think it's short shrifting them all to encounter them only in their poster representations. The topic that we have today, mapping and its discontents, well, I think you know when you've got a really great topic, well, not least by the fact that I think there were 100 people on the waiting list for whom we didn't have space today. That's surely a good sign. But for me, you know you have a good topic when it generates good questions. And you know you have good questions when those just continue to unfold and deepen and open out into new and better, unexpected, provocative, and rich questions. And I know that sounds like a humanist's pitch for a jobs program, because the questions, if they're good ones, do keep us very busy. But I think it's absolutely true with regard to the topics that this symposium on mapping and its discontents have generated. All the talks promise that, and I'm sure we'll have very lively engagement with the responses and the Q&A sessions as well. Those questions sometimes can be very basic and fundamental ones, like what is a map? A question which came up quite concretely when we were looking at the submissions for the mapping competition. What is a map and what isn't a map? What do maps do? I think over a very long period of time, we have seen maps do a number of different things. We've seen them help us know where we are. They're ways for us to locate ourselves in space, principally. We know that they help us find our way. We know that they help us identify what's out there, reference points being everything from the heavens above to the oceans and coastlines. Maps and different kinds of charting have a very, very long and entwined history. But I think the engagement with maps keeps changing, and I understand the topic of discontent to be pointing us towards some of the ways in which maps change over time. And certainly one of the things I've noticed through my involvement with the planning for the symposium and the map competition is that maps are now asking and answering different kinds of questions. They're asking and answering questions about who we are among. They're asking and answering questions about the constellations of human activities. Maps typically render something that's three-dimensional and spatial in a two-dimensional form, but now it seems quite important for those involved in mapping to reintroduce not a third dimension but a fourth dimension, and that's the dimension of time. So I think mapping and its discontents, I don't understand discontent to be certainly not our final position about maps. Hopefully we will continue to be somewhat discontent with maps, because that will no doubt point us to their evolution. I take it principally to be a sign of the kind of rich and unfolding and deep questions that they ask, and that their answers provoke us to continue asking. It's a great pleasure to introduce Denis Wood, a geographer born in Cleveland with an incredibly fascinating background. He grew up in Cleveland, and then attended Western Reserve University, from which he graduated with a degree in English. Along the way, I have learned he worked unloading ore boats as a laborer and oiler and operating a rail carry car, a Larry car, on Republic's Steel's upper dock. He received an MA and a PhD in geography from Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts, and then from 1974 through 96 taught environmental psychology and design at the College of Design at North Carolina State University, where he was professor of design and landscape architecture. During those years, he wrote extensively about film and maps, including The Power of Maps, published in '92. He also curated the award-winning Cooper Hewitt National Museum of Design exhibit on that same title, which was subsequently mounted at the Smithsonian. He co-authored Home Rules in 1994 and also taught in the International Relations program at Duke University. Among his many books are Seeing Through Maps, The Power of Images to Shape Our World, 5 Billion Years of Global Change, A History of the Land in 2004, and Making Maps, A Visual Guide to Map Design for GIS. In 2008, University of Chicago Press published The Natures of Maps, Cartographic Constructions of the Natural World, which he co-authored with John Fells. He exhibits and lectures widely and has been featured in interviews with Ira Glass for This American Life, and in 2008 gave the plenary address on the future of maps to the Royal Geographical Society in London. His publishing and lecturing is continued unabated, and it's a great pleasure to have him here today and a great honor to welcome him. The respondent to his talk is my great colleague and friend Michael Deere, professor of city regional planning in the College of Environmental Design at Berkeley. So I think I want to make sure I've covered all the necessary housekeeping rules, points. I think so. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Denis Wood. Thank you.
I'm going to read. I wrote this. It's a complicated argument, so I'm going to read it. And it takes about 36 minutes. So, the origin of the map, says John Noble Wilford, is lost to history. But so's that of yodeling, punk rock, and skateboarding. We can run the origin of anything back into the primordial muck, back through this stage and that, to the Big Bang. Scott McCloud does this with comics. Well, not to the Big Bang, but back through the codices of the Aztecs, Mixtecs, and Zapotecs, back through the Bayeux tapestry and Japanese scrolls, back through Trajan's columns and Greek vase painting, to the tomb paintings of the Egyptians better than 3 millennia ago. At which point McCloud says, I'll gladly admit that I have no idea where or when comics originated. Let others wrestle with that one. But there is one event which looms as large in comics history as it does in the history of the written word, the invention of printing. Though it's not until the maturation of color lithography and the daily newspapers in the last decade of the 19th century that, as McCloud says, the comics we call comics began to appear. In the history of map making, it's the maps that we call maps that are historically significant, that matter. And the invention of printing looms as large in their history as it does in that of comics. So the 15th century is as good a place to start the history of maps. Better, actually, since while comics don't really take off until the 20th century, maps take off right away. Of course, printing was hardly the only thing that happened in the 15th century, and the emergence of the modern nation state was every bit as important to the emergence of map making. Probably the way to think about it is as the emergence of a complex of functions, all of which depended on, all of which reinforced each other. The modern nation state, the map, the spread of printing, movable type, the voyages of Sheng He and Christopher Columbus, a lot of things all over the world. Like most human artifacts, like cars, tables, belt buckles, spoons, the maps are more readily exemplified than defined. You point to one. This is a map, you say. What a map most is becomes apparent in use. This hasn't stopped anyone from trying to define maps, at least not since the 17th century, when simultaneously, in places as far-flung as England, Russia, Japan, New Spain, and elsewhere, maps and map-making first became common. A content analysis of hundreds of definitions of maps makes it plain that maps are supposed to be representations of a part of the Earth's surface. Now, this way of thinking about maps naturalizes them, and naturalizing them universalizes them. Both obscure the map's origins in the rise of the state. Naturalizing the map helps pass over the map's role in the establishment and maintenance of social relations in societies where maps are common. It conflates maps and map-making with universal human, even with animal abilities, like orientation, wayfinding, and other aspects of spatial intelligence. This conflation of maps with fundamental cognitive abilities makes it a slur on a population, a denigration of its cognitive or cultural capacities to deny that it makes or uses maps. Therefore, it's claimed that everyone uses maps and always has. But just as people long lived, and as many continue to live without writing, nonetheless carrying on a rich human life, so people have long lived, and many continue to live without maps. People create maps only when their social relations call for them, and the social relations that most insistently call for maps are those of the modern nation state, wherever in the world. People make maps to discover their minds and to connect themselves. These are also the reasons people talk. So where talk serves, maps are rare. But when talk becomes inadequate, either because the discourse gets too complicated, or there are too many people, or they are separated by too great a distance or too much time, as invariably happens with the emergence of modern states, people develop alternative forms of communication. For the past 30,000 years, people have been making artifacts that anticipate the sorts of things that today we call badges and genealogies and inventories and almanacs and histories and itineraries and maps. Anticipate because the distinctions we draw among these very different discourse functions took a long time to evolve, and in many cases have only recently achieved their current form. Paleolithic peoples bundled these discourse functions together on incised bones. We've been pulling them apart ever since. Elaborating on Paleolithic achievements, people have constructed an ever-widening repertoire of cultural forms: clothing, ritual, pottery, painting, sculpture, architecture, drawing, writing, books, print, film, blogs, within which they've encoded ever more elaborate communications. Paralleling the proliferation of forms has been a comparable expansion of the powers of sign systems: gestural, sculptural, pictorial, pictographic, symbolic, numeric, syllabic, alphabetic, and others, often overlapped and mixed up in rich syntheses of functions, forms, and meaning.
Are you supposed to be showing pictures right now?
No.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. When I don't want you to see what I'm not talking about, I don't put it up. But I can understand that it might cause some concern. Among these syntheses, the map is comparatively novel. Most English speakers use map in a straightforward way to describe an artifact, still commonly printed on paper, if increasingly taking electronic form, that selectively links places in the world, theirs, to other kinds of things, to thises, to taxes, for example, and to voting rights, to species abundance, to the incidence of rainfall. They do this to underwrite the reproduction or the contestation of the social relations of power. That is, maps are more or less permanent, more or less graphic artifacts that support the descriptive function in human discourse that links territory to other things, advancing in this way the interests of those making or controlling the making of the maps. These maps have comparatively shallow roots in human history, almost all of them having been made since 1500. In fact, almost all the maps ever made have been made during the past 100 years, the vast majority in the past few decades. So many maps are made today, and they are reproduced in such numbers that no one any longer has any idea how many. The maps printed annually by no more than the world's newspapers number easily in the billions. In contrast, the maps surviving from everywhere in the world for all of human history prior to the rise of the modern nation-state number, in a very inclusive definition of the map, in the very low thousands, as if all the humans on the planet had made a single map each year, one here, another there, across the preceding couple of millennia. Paralleling the explosion in map numbers has been a corresponding penetration of the map into ever deeper recesses of our lives. If there is some sense in which maps may be said to have existed in the ancient and medieval worlds, they were confined to sporadic large-scale property control and rare small-scale cosmological speculation functions. This is to say that, starting around 2300 BCE, Babylonian scribes made large-scale drawings of temples, houses, and fields that might have been related to property transactions. That during the 8th century CE, Japanese scribes made large-scale drawings of paddy fields to document ownership during a period of intense landholding consolidation. That from the 12th through the 15th centuries, English scribes made large-scale drawings of monasteries, cathedrals, and fields, invariably for planning and legal purposes, and so on. That is, a very large-scale graphic property control function can be documented prior to the emergence of the modern state, sporadically and discontinuously in various places around the world. But there is no suggestion that they participated in anything like a broader map-making tradition. For example, there were no connections to the rare small-scale cosmograms that can also be documented from equally disparate times and places, to the so-called Babylonian world map of circa 600 BCE, for example, to medieval Mappamundi, or to the Buddhological world maps, such as the Japanese Gotenjiku-zu of the 14th century. Again, nobody doubts that these drawings participated in local traditions of cosmological speculation, but the lack of any connection to the large-scale property control tradition makes it hard to maintain that there was any sort of overarching map-making tradition to which these drawings could be tributary, much less a map-making tradition that penetrated to any degree at all the lives of ordinary men and women. Contrast this now with the radically different situation that dawns with the 16th century, when vast swaths of territory were increasingly subjected to systematic surveys by newly self-conscious states. In 1559, for example, the Habsburg Emperor Philip II of Spain commissioned a detailed survey of his possessions in the Netherlands, in 1566 of those in Spain, in 1575 of those in southern Italy, and in 1577 of those in New Spain. In 1591, the Japanese hegemon, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, ordered all daimyo to submit summary cadastral records and maps for the construction of a countrywide cadastre, and the shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu ordered the submission of a second set of cadastral and cartographic documents in 1604. In 1663, Louis XIV's Minister for Home Affairs, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, commissioned the collection of surveys and maps to cover all of France, while in 1666, the governor of Siberia commissioned the mapping of the territories under his control. In fact, most early modern states initiated projects like these. If not all were completed as initially hoped, for example, Philip's of New Spain wasn't, return from Hideyoshi's request were spotty, the efforts did lay the ground for the increasingly comprehensive and intrusive surveys, including the 19th century inauguration of national topographic mapping programs, which were widely completed during the 20th century, as well as the production, to give but one example, of fire and insurance atlases that not only posted the ground plans of individual homes, but included the construction details of heating systems. Today we map the weather in something like real time, the locations of sex offenders, the historical ecology of Upper Penitencia Creek, school attendance zones, atmospheric ozone, the conversion of rainforest to farmland, street vendors in Ho Chi Minh City, regularly updated locations of roadblocks in West Bank, reported instances of the West Nile virus, the tribes of San Francisco, the locations of tomorrow's highway construction delays, Zagreb's Green Horseshoe, cell phone towers, the tax value of homes, bus routes, bike paths, prison expenditures in Brooklyn by census block, consumer preference by zip code. Is there anything we don't map? So pervasive and taken for granted are maps that it is hard to accept the recency and the continued relative isolation of their general use, or to appreciate the 17th century explosion in their numbers that we continue to experience today. Okay, this is obviously hyperbole, and it probably would have been better to say there were no maps before 1400. But I'm desperate to arrest the course of the insane idea brooded about, often by people who know nothing about it, that maps are this universal human construct, that they've been around since before recorded time, since before writing, that they stand outside history. Now, I'm not saying maps had no role in human affairs prior to 1500, but that after 1500, maps began to play the role in human affairs that they continue to play today. The decision to draw the line here is like Ian Hacking's drawing the line for the birth of statistics at 1660. It's not that there hadn't been all kinds of precursors, the tossing of Sumerian knuckle bones, dice throwing by Marcus Aurelius, 9th century Indian theorizing about probability, but that we do not ask how some concept of probability became possible. Rather, we need to understand a quite specific event that occurred around 1660, the emergence of our concept of probability. Why? Because for Hacking, the search for preconditions is more than an effort of historical exploration. I am inclined to think, he said, that the preconditions for the emergence of our concept of probability determine the very nature of this intellectual object, and therefore the very nature of quantum mechanics, statistical inference, and inductive logic. I think this is as true of maps. The point is not to know that some 12th century monk was able to make a plan of his monastery. Humans have had the capacity to do this since they were humans. But rather why no one felt it was worthwhile to follow up his idea, to make a plan of the fields outside the monastery, a plan of monastic holdings, a plan of the route from Canterbury to Southwark, why the idea died. Unlike the idea which, when developed in the 16th century, didn't die, but rather flourished in the most astonishing fashion. What I'm saying is that, for all intents and purposes, before 1500, okay, maybe 1400 and maybe 1200 in the case of China, people didn't make maps, and that's why uncontested maps more than 500 years old are rare at any scale from anywhere in the world. Now, there are some, but the significance of the data is obvious. Human societies didn't need maps and got on handily without them for hundreds of thousands of years. Yet during the last 2 or 3 millennia BCE, larger, more complicated societies, including China, Babylonia, Egypt, perhaps the Indic societies centered on Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, began to articulate graphic notation systems sporadically and apparently independently, but among and continuous with other indigenous textual productions, memorial inscriptions, memory aids, almanacs, genealogies, inventories, histories, and descriptions of routes and territory, in mixtures of sculptural, pictorial, pictographic, syllabic, consonantal, and or alphabetic forms that linked location with rights and obligations, as in the large-scale property maps, and with speculative attributes of the larger environment, as in the cosmological diagrams. Similar graphic notation systems filling related functions emerged fitfully in other civilizations, again, apparently independently, even acknowledging the extensive trade and other connections among these groups and the cultural exchanges that undoubtedly took place. The articulation of similar notation systems in so many of these societies strongly supports the notion that map discourse functions of this character inevitably emerge in societies whose increasing size and complication call for them, of which, again, the best example is China. But the sporadic nature of this articulation no less strongly suggests that at the size and degree of complication reached by most ancient civilizations, the map discourse function, as it has come to evolve, could be satisfied by other, better established discourse functions, generally scripted and or numeric, so that the map discourse function failed to establish itself no matter how many times it was seeded. The modern state, which in China may mean the song, with which it co-evolves as an instrument of polity, to assess taxes, to wage war, to facilitate communication, and to exploit strategic resources. It comes down to this. Few, if any, of the graphic notations produced in ancient or medieval civilizations would be considered maps today. The things we now recognize as maps gained currency only in the last 400 or so years, and within this period only in relatively stable states with entrenched, centralized bureaucracies and well-established academies. That is, in 1400, few people used maps, but by 1600, people around the world found them indispensable. There's a divide here that is impossible to evade. The dates of which maps really begin to appear in the historical record is indicative. Islamic maps may date to the 10th century, but they don't become common until the 15th and 16th centuries. The oldest surviving map of China may be from the 2nd century BCE, but maps aren't common until the 12th and only become abundant in the 17th century. Large-scale Japanese maps may survive from the 8th century, but national and provincial maps only begin appearing in the late 16th century and are not common until the 17th. The oldest surviving Hindu globe is from the 15th century. Vietnamese and European maps become plentiful only in the 15th and 16th centuries. Mesoamerican maps survive largely from the 16th century. Malay maps from the 16th century. Again and again, we find large centralized societies everywhere in the world inaugurating mapmaking traditions as a part of their tradition to the early modern state. Again, a transition China may have begun in the song. Why? What is it that happened after 1400 that called people to start making maps? The canonical answers, with their focus on so-called scientific mapmaking and their dependence on the presumption of a European exceptionalism, obviously can't account for the present developments in China or the parallel ones in Japan and elsewhere. But they're largely irrelevant even for Europe. These canonical accounts have always focused on the small-scale mapping of the world and the heroic growth of European knowledge, a story that accounts for none of the eruption of large-scale mapmaking that produced the vast bulk of the new maps in Europe. For example, that of the northern Italian plains. There, extant maps predating the 15th century can be counted on the fingers of one hand. But in the 16th century, map-making for border control, for water management, for treaty negotiations, and other such uses explodes. There's no other word for it. In the case of Venice, less than a single % of the 10,000 maps archived by the Venetian state predates 1565. In the case of Florence, only a dozen maps among the 10,000 archived by the Florentine state predates 1565, and the bulk of them, devoted to property control, dates from the 17th century. The offices commissioning most of the vast Milanese archive of over 76,000 maps were all founded in the 16th century. Identical accounts can be given for the Papal States and for Naples, minuscule numbers of maps before 1500, but afterwards, a cornucopial abundance of mostly large-scale administrative maps. And identical accounts can be given for the rest of Europe and outside Europe and Russia, China, and Japan, where by the late 17th century, as Mary Elizabeth Berry has put it, literally thousands of Japanese maps covering virtually every domestic subject and in virtually every format had issued from government offices and commercial presses. The explanations for this explosion of mapmaking vary from place to place. But the general implication that mapmaking emerges as a rationalizing tool of control during periods of relative or increasing prosperity in early state economies is broadly supported, where the signal ability was that of the map to perform the shape of statehood. It's important to remember that if the map was a novel function during the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, so was the state. Although today we take the state for granted, exactly as we do the map, nothing like the modern state existed in earlier periods. Doubtless there were earlier polities that resemble the modern state in many ways. The Greek polis does, the Roman Empire does, China does under the Tang. But they differ from the modern state in essential ways. In any case, the modern state did not derive directly from any of them. Evolving from a period in which loyalty had been offered to one's lord, to one's immediate community, and to one's family, and that was typified by a powerful sense of mutual obligations among face-to-face acquaintances, this new political structure, with its impersonal institutions and ultimately abstract character, required new forms for its embodiment. Contemporary scholarship is unanimous that the map possessed an all but unique ability to give the elusive idea of the state concrete form. As Martin Bruckner argues about the young United States, the image of the national map was one of the few visual artifacts demonstrating what many perceived to be either an abstract or even untenable fiction, namely that there could be a national union between disjointed regions and politically disparate people. At the same time, the maps also spoke to outsiders, as in Qing, China, where Laura Hostetler has argued that using scaled maps was an effective way to stake out claims of empire to an encroaching Europe. The Kanxi Atlas defined what China was territorially to the rest of the early modern world, as also in the case of Britain, whose imperial maps sought, Bruckner insists, to persuade the map's readers on either side of the Atlantic of British ownership rights regarding the North American continent. Similar conclusions have been reached with regard to early modern and even much later mapping programs in France, Thailand, and elsewhere. The most striking feature about all these assertions is their persuasion that the map was an artifact that constructed the state, that literally helped to bring the state into being. It's almost as though it were the map that, in a graphic performance of statehood, conjured the state as such into existence, out of the disjointed rabble of American colonies, out of the far-flung possessions of Chinese emperors, out of the territories of the recently warring daimyo of Japan, out of the disparate peoples of Tsarist Russia, out of the jungles of Guyana. Thongchai Winachukul has termed this map-made construct the geo-body and has characterized the emergence of Thailand's geo-body as a victory of mapping. The geo-body is produced by mapping in three distinct but interdependent ways. Mapping requires that the state be something mappable, that is, a thing with edges, a geo-body. When mapped, these borders establish a shape, the nation's visual form, and this rapidly becomes totemic, iconic. Through the map's presentation of the state as an existent thing, its origins and history are obscured. This promotes rhetoric about the inviolability and so the necessity of defending borders, which returns us to the first way maps produce the geo-body. Large-scale property mapping may seem far removed from these sorts of national considerations, but the fact is that large-scale property mapping, state and province-scale mapping, and small-scale regional and world mapping were reciprocally supportive. In Japan, for instance, Hideyoshi conceived of mapmaking as a localized and incremental program, which, while an undoubted expression of state control, was more importantly an instrument of conversion through the collaborative, ongoing labor of mapping itself. As Mary Elizabeth Berry puts it, precisely because union was fractious and unfamiliar, cartography served the conquerors by instilling a fugitive idea of cohesion, not by reflecting any palpable reality. In this way, Hideyoshi and his successors not only normalized a nascent polity, but invented and instructed countless participants in the very imagining of our country. In Russia, too, the unabashedly local maps made during litigation over property represented, in Valery Kavilson's words, the authority of the central state in the provinces. They exhibited the skill of the central state apparatus at extending its influence and bringing its routinized practices and language to the local arena. The interests of center and periphery intersected in the use of the maps. While large-scale local mapping invokes the state's authority, small-scale mapping allows the state to emerge with sharper focus against the images of other states in a world context. In Japan's case, Jesuit maps brought about a heightened consciousness of our country. By depicting alien worlds, or as Berry has it, a Japan assumed its strong cartographic profile as attention to the globe and lands that were not Japan reoriented the geographical imagination. And in the cases of Russia and China, Kavilson and Hostetler have both stressed the mutual awareness that maps help provoke. Examples of this kind of cross-scale reinforcement of the reality of the state can be multiplied almost endlessly as states proliferated in the 19th and 20th centuries. In India, for example, in Israel, states scarcely 60 years old, identical patterns of map use can be found. What cannot be overlooked is what gave maps their ability to embody this novel entity in the first place. Since scholars are unanimous that maps help to bring the state into being, that maps helped construct the state, it certainly can't be the map's putative ability to represent a part of the Earth's surface. After all, it was the maps that conjured up borders where none had existed, especially well documented for the United States, Russia, Thailand, and colonial British Guiana. The maps that summoned unity from chaos, as we have seen for Japan, Russia, and the United States. The maps that enrobed the shapeless, as in the case of China. That is, the maps that endowed with form what from the beginning had been no more than a dream, the dream of every early modern state. But then thinking about the map as a representation had always been a mask, a cloak, a way of making the creative aspects of mapmaking disappear. From their inception, it had been essential that states appear as facts of nature, as real, enduring things, things like mountains, and at all costs to obscure their recent origins in violence and their tenuous holds on tomorrow. And maps were able to grant this precisely because maps too had been constructed as facts of nature. We know more than show what exists, said the maps. Even today, they say this about the borders between Pakistan and India, Israel and Palestine, India and China. What maps thereby avoided saying was, it exists, yes, but only on these maps, which in fact create and affirm their existence, even as the maps created and affirmed their own existence, most effectively by hiding their own recent origins in the state itself. In effect, maps are systems of propositions, where a proposition is nothing more than a statement that affirms or denies the existence of something. As such, maps are arguments about existence. And if they began by arguing for the existence of paddy fields, long fields, and manor lands, the nation states the fields came to compose, and the world composed by the nation states, maps have gone on to a long career, rich in the affirmation of the existence of a bewildering variety of things. The island continent of California, for instance, the great American desert, and the open polar sea. What these have in common with geologic strata, frontal weather systems, and the hole in the ozone is that they're all very hard to imagine without the creative intercession of the map. It's salutary to remember that this too is what nation states once were, very hard to imagine without the creative intercession of the map. How did Bruckner put it? The national map was one of the few visual artifacts demonstrating what many perceived to be either an abstract or even untenable fiction, namely that there could be a national union between disjointed regions and politically disparate peoples. By arguing for the nation's existence with all the facticity at its command, the map turned the fiction into a fact. But as systems of propositions, maps are necessarily composed of signs. The propositions are embedded in signs, where signs are unions of signifieds, the subjects of the proposition, say the state, and signifiers, the marks put down on the paper, say the lines supposed to be the borders. The signifieds and signifiers are united by a code. In school, we're taught to look for this code in the legend. A star means a capital. But the legend only displays the top part of the code, the part of the iceberg above the water. All the submerged part, that part of the code, is taken for granted. The way locations on the map refer to locations in the world. The way words work, words and letters themselves are signs. The way the lines work, and that they work in different ways. The lines around the map in one way, the lines on the map in others. These relationships between signifieds and signifiers are wholly conventional, essentially arbitrary. So the connections between signifieds and signifiers are, for all their taken for granted quality, never secure. And from the beginning, the signifiers have been slipping their moorings. What this has meant has been that from the beginning, they could have a life of their own, independent of the needs of the state or the interests of property, or even of a commitment to represent the world. And they began to live it immediately. For example, as early as 1516, a map of an imaginary island was published as the frontispiece to Thomas More's Utopia. And over the next 500 years, the use of maps to lend credence to imaginary places exploded too. With the publication in the middle of the 17th century of Madeleine de Scudéry's Carte de Tendre, the door was opened onto the instantly popular world of allegorical maps. The map of tenderness, the map of the realm of love, the map of marriage. And with this, imaginary and allegorical maps proliferated together. In the late 17th century, Johann Baptist Thumann made maps of the utopian Schlaraffenland. A couple of decades later, Matthaus Suter was mapping an attack of love. In 1726, Jonathan Swift famously published Gulliver's Travels with its maps of Lilliput and Hunaham's land. As famously, Robert Louis Stevenson published his map of Treasure Island in 1883. In the 20th century, the allegorical map stream dwindled, though it very much trickles into the present. But on the other hand, the mapping of imaginary places swelled into an Amazon at flood. The potent examples of E.H. Shepard's maps of the 100-Acre Wood and Toad Hall, and especially J.R.R. Tolkien's maps of Middle-earth and The Hobbit, and his son Christopher Tolkien's maps in The Lord of the Rings, inspired everyone with a pen or a mouse to start making maps of imaginary worlds. Maps which turned into game boards, see Dungeons and Dragons, which evolved and turned into map-based video games like Grand Theft Auto, and so into massively multiplayer online role-playing games like World of Warcraft. That is to say, into an enormous industry. Even as these heterodox uses of maps were expanding, others were evolving that on occasion refused to exploit even the propositional character of the map, uses that were capable of consuming maps whole, almost as free signifiers. This is the world of map art, initially unleashed from the spirit and practice of collage, by the spirit and practice of collage in the years following World War I, as Dadaists and Surrealists began to use maps in their work. Since then, lettrists, situationists, pop artists, earth artists, conceptual artists, fluxus artists, and others in ever-growing numbers have found in the map a congenial object, a fruitful subject, and/or a productive method. Today, it's hard to keep track even of map art exhibitions. So numerous have, whoa, what's that doing there? So numerous have they, yeah, okay. So numerous have they become, and art about maps, of maps, and resulting in maps fetches insane sums at auction. Whatever all this is about, it's about many things. It's clear not only that it makes a mockery of the traditional claim that maps are in any sense a representation of a part of the Earth's surface, even as it illustrates, indeed illuminates, the map's propositional character, but also that it makes a mockery of any idea that the state and its interests so monopolize the map that it cannot and has not been released to other functions. Just as the characteristic alibi of the map to be an aid to navigation obscures its use in framing the state, bounding jurisdictions, and controlling property, so the idea that it does nothing else obscures the map use as something to tuck under a dresser to keep it from wobbling. It's bootless to pretend that the map grew to its contemporary prominence for some purpose other than underwriting the reproduction, if increasingly the contestation, of the social relations of power. And it would be stupid to overlook the prominence of the state in many of the map's alternative roles. It's hard, for instance, to miss the state in Moore's Utopia, in Swift's Gulliver, in Marvel's universe, or for that matter, in much of the map art that was created during the 20th century. Nor is it hard to argue that playing with map states only strengthens the authority of states on the normative map. But it would be equally stupid to pretend that the state's stranglehold on cartography isn't weakening. Cartography, the state's apparatus for training and constraining map makers, is certainly dead. And it doesn't look as though the professionals and academics are going to be able to repeat the cartography trick with GIS, computer and internet map making. That genie seems to be very much out of the bottle, even when it also has to be confessed that much of it amounts to little more than sticking pins onto Google Maps. Even so, it's astonishing how many people are taking to map making and the things they're mapping, and many of the maps they're making are extraordinary and powerful. The map was not founded in some primal instinct, as Wilford imagined, to communicate a sense of place, some sense of here in relation to there, but in the needs of the nascent state to take on form and organize its many interests. But the relationship between signified and signifier is ever precarious, and what meant one thing in the beginning can mean its opposite today, or nothing, or everything. People are at play in the field of map signs, and the latent power of the map is waiting to be unleashed. The map is dead. Long live the map. Thanks.
Hi everybody, my name is Michael Deere, and I have the worst task in the world, which is to say, get this conference back on its scheduled time. Especially since I'm so excited. I mean, this is a very exciting day for me. There's lots of my idols and stars here. I might have to take an early bathroom break, but let's just wait and see how it goes. Special welcomes to my UCLA colleagues, Dana Cuff and her Vatos Locos. I think that their passports were actually confiscated in Oakland airport, so they're not going to go back for a while to Southern California. That said, Dennis, I said to Dennis, you know, you can do this without the maps. I was wrong. It was so much of an electric presentation. I cannot imagine a better way to start this conference, and indeed these whole sets of projects that we're talking about. The way I see it is this, and I'll be brief in my estimation and then make a few remarks because we do have to get back on time. What Dennis has been talking about is revolutions in mappings, really. He didn't call them that, he called them explosions, which I think is as good a word anyway. The first revolution was about nation statehood, exploration, empire, and very importantly, printing, which he emphasized in his paper. Performing the shape of statehood, I think was a good way of putting it, as well as it being an instrument of conversion. It's the second revolution that I'm more interested in, when maps were unleashed and a popular cartography developed. These were democratizing map making. These were making maps that were digital as distinct from printed maps, although there are both, and I believe that we absolutely have to have both. We map everything now. The mapping of imaginary places, the map art, could be regarded as transitional forms on the way to that popular democracy. So I'm talking in the first part in assessing Denis's contribution as explaining the move from geopolitics to popular cartography, if you like. I'm going to focus on the second revolution. It's a really interesting history, and it's a really interesting period that we're going through in lots of ways right now. In geography, for example, the whole rise of geographical information systems, or now called geographical information science, has made a huge difference to the kinds of mappings that goes on based on storage, processing, and representation of very large data sources. Keyword in this exercise is layering. Now, of course, it's linked to the larger technological revolution, which I will not go into today. From the humanities, you've also seen a flourishing of new ideas, new initiatives. It's a so-called historical GIS, the so-called spatial humanities, and now most recently the digital humanities, which seems still to be too restrictive terms to me, by the way. The convergences that are occurring in this revolution are by far and away the most interesting thing to me, at least. What we'd call an experimental cartography or a radical cartography, practitioners of which are in the audience amongst us today. The really interesting thing here to me is the intentionality of the mapping. Okay? So we're not talking about state building anymore, but we are asking the question categorically, in whose service is this mapping directed? And the easy answer in experimental and radical cartography is the people and their politics, not the politics of the state. And you can see that in some of my own work and the work of others in the move towards the geohumanities, as I've called it, which I regard as being a more inclusive term that it encompasses others beyond those with digital expertise. What's interesting about this work is that the practitioners not only study the cultures, but they're also engaged in producing the culture simultaneously. And it's that dynamism that I think is worth excavating. Now, how does the excavation go on? And this is where I branch off a little bit from Denis and try to look at some of the implications of his work for our exercise at the various universities. I mean, I'm interested in the search for a common ground between, crudely stated, the humanists and the environmental studies people, the social sciences, if you want to call them that. And in my hunt, in my word hunt, I'm going through words like map and mapping as some of the most important primitives. And I think they've been masterfully expounded upon by Denis. I'm going to say no more about them. But then we need to start also looking at those maps, and this is why I like the maps so much, for their content, for their form, for their attention to aesthetics, and for me, most importantly, their analytical and interpretive power and consequences. What does this map do? As Denis said, what a map most is becomes apparent in use. I think that's a very important starting point for my search for a vocabulary among various disciplines of map making. The mapping as a verb, as distinct from a map as a noun, of course has to deal with a wide variety of texts, the processing of information, and representations that are evolved. To that, you can add your own other keywords like psychogeographies and so on, as Rebecca Sonnet has worked on so much. But you can make your own list of keywords. But we have to have those keywords to start. Those starting point, however, is insufficient. And what I'd like to do in a couple of minutes is to say the following, that we also need clearly a grammar for this conversation. I think, I'm not going to put words in Denis's mouth, but he talked about signs and signifiers, and that's a very good place to start. But let me, by way of caution, suggest that when we begin these conversations as we are now, when we get together at the end of this perambulation on the deck there, on the balcony, be watchful about what we are all saying to each other. First, all evidence is not equal, is not equivalent. A MapQuest way of finding is not the same as a mashup, which is about connectivity, is not the same as a montage, which is about art. What I'd like to avoid, and I've seen this happen so many times, and I do it myself, is I want to avoid accumulations of undifferentiated evidence. All those maps were doing vastly different things. And to put them up on the wall like this is a really tough thing for me to grasp. They look beautiful, but they're doing so many different things. I want to be very clear that we're not just accumulating evidences and patting ourselves on the back because we've got so many interesting maps to show each other. The point is, of course, second point, I guess, is to think about what goes into producing the map. What kind of evidence is being alluded to? Avoiding the seductions of aesthetics and rhetorics and ignorance. So we can't accept the totally inconsequential, beautiful map if it's just plain wrong by some measure. What's hidden? As Denis said, the kind of sequestered codes that go into producing a map are so easy to forget. Do you know how much error there is in a simple GIS map? When all the data gaps, when all the missing data are elided over, when estimations are introduced and compounded time and time again until they produce a beautiful map which is totally wrong and completely unreliable. Last warning, when you go outside, watch out for this. Avoid the hegemony of true believers of all kinds. Me included. I think we need to listen to the differences by which we approach these things that we call simply maps, for example. I do believe that a map has, to be a map, it has to be grounded in a geographical sense of reality. A diagram is not a map. I can explain this in the break in more detail if you want to, but think of Edward Tufte's visual display of quantitative information there to see the difference between a diagram and a map. That wonderful map of the loss of Napoleon's army as he went to Russia and he came back. That is a map. That's not a diagram. Okay, so I will argue that for a long time. Listen to the differences, because I'm as prejudiced as anybody else. But listen with an epistemological and an ontological openness. That is, I think, above all what we need today and in these projects. Isaiah Berlin, amongst others, has written very eloquently about the essential incommensurability in our various languages. And we have to learn to live with that. But learning to live with that, however, does not involve blandly accepting all kinds of evidence as equivalents. So stay alert to difference, avoid reductionism, and you will have a happy, happy day. I welcome you back. And now I have a few minutes in which to invite questions. Please direct your questions at Denis. Then we will have to break, and you have a very short 5-minute coffee break. That's the orders from above. So we'll come back and continue our discussions. So if you have questions, please make them extremely pointed and short. And you can identify, no, there's even more interesting information. The tension raises. Are you going to say something, Susan?
No, I was going to say, please use the microphone.
Oh, we have microphones, so put up your paws and if you have a question. Short,
Yeah,
punchy.
I just have a quick question, which is, it seems that you're interested primarily in terrestrial mapping, and there's a huge body of evidence of celestial mapping and using of time and space and geography from a long time before 1500. And I wonder if you could speak to that.
I don't know how ancient maps of the stars are. However, I also know that the stars are named and constellated. And those names and constellations refer to and reinforce and support dominant understandings of the way the world is organized. I think it's probably a pretty parallel track as I look back. I haven't studied it.
Next. Lisa.
Hi, Denis. Thinking what you were saying about, now that everybody is mapping, mapping is kind of democratized, and we're in an age of sort of dataphilia. Everything is mapped constantly. everyone is mapping everything themselves constantly. What do you think the consequences of this dataphilia are?
I hope it's going to mean the end of the map. I mean, I see that if I'm right about this, that maps have like a 500 or 600 year history, or a 400 or 500 or 600 year history. They've evolved to serve a need, and I want to imagine that that need is going to disappear. That the state is going to state's going to wither. I'm going to be dead, so I think it's going to be interesting what happens. Well, it's certainly going to be interesting. And I think the way we create visualizations to deal with that new situation will be very different from the way we're doing it today. So, I don't think this map form that we've been working on here, that I've been detailing here, that's not forever, That's come, and it's going to go. And I'll be dead before it goes, but I don't think I'll be dead all that long before, people are talking about some really interesting new form of handling all this data, or handling all this stuff.
Dennis is in his cheerful mode at the moment. Dana Cuff, please.
Let me ask a non-cheerful question then. It's over here to your left.
To my left.
Hey, Dennis.
Sorry.
Any worries about a kind of Foucauldian self-surveillance where all this information that we're providing just enables, the state and state forms, to, better surveil us because we're opening up ourselves and all of our information to that surveillance?
So one of the things we know, thanks to Mr. Snowden, is that we're all being much more heavily surveilled than even the most paranoid of us imagined. And all I note is it doesn't seem to be helping them do anything. It's too much. They get lost with all that data. You need patterns, you need pictures, and there are too many of us now. There are 7 going on 8 billion of us already, and they're all crazy. That's
Dana Cuff.
I wonder if you see any functional difference for the purposes of the state between an itinerary and a map with the incorporation of time. How short was that, Michael?
In an itinerary, meaning...
Well, like the Marco Polo's Silk Road maps versus a comprehensive map of China.
Well, I think they serve different, but different roles, but they add up to the same thing in the end. I'm not really concerned about state maps being maps that draw borders around states. I think that's an essential and important function that they serve in this history. But all the other maps participate equally in the construction of that sense of statehood, that sense of nationhood. So they're all involved, the maps of itineraries and the maps of individual fields and property ownership and the map of the nation and the map of the world. They're all reciprocally connected in this nest of mapping that enables the state to function as it has for the last 200 or 300 years.
I think we have to stop the formal question. I'm really sorry about this, but you have 5 minutes to run out, get a coffee, and in the meantime, your most important duty is to thank Dennis for a wonderful kickoff to the conference.